Yeah, you have to have some word for them, you know? I made it up.
The purposivist derives the meaning of text from purpose, and not purpose from the meaning of the text. That's related to the living Constitution, or that's distinct?
That's distinct. Look, there are two things that the book urges lawyers to be and judges to be. Number one is textualists. Okay, the point you just made is a point urged by someone who is not at all a textualist. He doesn't want to be bound by the text at all. And he just looks at what was the purpose of this text. And once he figures out, you know, any purpose can be identified at an infinite number of levels, at the top of which is, you know, do good and avoid evil. And depending on what level of generality you pick, you can make a very narrow statute into a very broad statute, because the broad purpose that it seeks is this, and therefore, even though the text does not specifically address that particular question, the question ought to be answered that way because of this text. That's a person who is not a textualist. He's a purposivist. Even if you are a textualist, though, and you say, yes, we're bound by the text, you can give the text the meaning it bore at the time, or you can say, and indeed many of the living constitutionalists, they say we are all textualists now. Yeah, they all start with the text,
Right.
But
they don't end with it.
They don't end with it, and they don't give it the meaning it had when the people adopted it. That's especially important when you're dealing with a constitution, because a constitution takes out of the democratic process certain particular items. And you're tampering with democracy when you remove items that the people really never agreed to remove. You know, the death penalty is a good example. I've sat with 4 colleagues who thought it was unconstitutional, even though it's absolutely clear that the American people never, ever voted to make the death penalty unconstitutional. When the 8th Amendment was adopted, the Cruel and Unusual Punishments Clause, the death penalty was the only penalty for a felony. It was the definition of a felony. Every state had the death penalty. So nobody could plausibly claim that the American people said no state shall have the death penalty. But I've sat with 4 colleagues who have taken that position and say the death penalty is unconstitutional, because it ought to be, because nowadays we ought to consider it cruel and unusual. That distorts democracy. It ought to be up to the American people to take something out of democracy, to take it away from, you know, the Constitution doesn't require you to have the death penalty. You think it's a bad idea, persuade your fellow citizens and abolish it, as many states have done. But, you know, to say that the American people rendered it beyond the pale of democracy is just absurd.